All right, so people are going to keep coming in, but I don't want to, we have only 1 hour. I want to make sure we use it well. My name is Sarah Neuter. I'm a professor of classics and theater and performance studies at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to moderate this event. So I want to give you all an overview of how we're going to do this. We are here to discuss the really wonderful book by Derek Attridge called The Experience of Poetry, which I'll say more about in a bit. We have 3 panelists, myself and 2 others who I'll also introduce. So after I do introductions and Professor Attridge says a few words, we are going to take turns each asking him a few questions. But we are open to the fluidity of conversation if that opens up as well. We're hoping to save 10-15 minutes of time for questions at the end. So if you have a question at any point in the first part of the hour, please just write it in the chat, either to me or to everyone, or just write the word question if you'd rather ask it vocally. So let me just take one more moment to thank the Seminary Co-op for providing us with this time space, and to thank Poetry and Poetics for bringing this together, and especially Starship Guild, who makes everything happen. Our first panelist is Professor Tim Harrison. He is the Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Assistant Professor of Renaissance and Early Modern Literature in the Department of English at the University of Chicago. He's the author of the wonderful book, Coming to Consciousness and Natality in Early Modern England, which came out last year, and has also written a number of wonderful articles. Our other second panelist is Rosanna Warren. She's the Hannah Holborn Gray Distinguished Service Professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. She is the author of 4 beautiful books of poetry, and most recently, So Forth, which also came out last year. She also has published a gorgeous book of literary criticism called Fables of the Self, Studies in Lyric Poetry, and has edited and translated and written a multiplicity of essays and received numerous awards. And last but very far from least, we have Derek Attridge, our author today. He is an emeritus professor at the University of York in English and related literature. He is the author of 15 books that especially focus on English, South African, and Irish literature, as well as the editor of many collections and the author of many essays. I mean, one of the really special things I think about Professor Attridge's work is how he manages to be so incredibly forward thinking about literary theory, and at the same time, incredibly appreciative of, and even I would say a promoter of, the importance of poetic form. I find it rare that those two come together so beautifully as they do in his work. And so just to name one prior example of it, like many, many books, his 2004 book, The Singularity of Literature, is a really captivating example of how he sees literature as an event and how he brings forth the power of art. And I think that may come up again later today. So without further ado, I want to just hand things over to Professor Attridge for a moment before I launch in. So thank you all.
Thanks, Sarah. This book started as a project in 1996, which I concocted in order to see if I could be successful in a Leverhulme Trust fellowship competition, which unusually offered 5 years of research. So the project had to be commensurately large. And I was lucky enough to get it, but other things kept getting in the way. So it took some 20 years before I finished it. And as you can imagine, over 20 years, the debts that I've accumulated to colleagues and to readers and to institutions have been enormous. So I'm not going to repeat now the acknowledgements that take up a lot of space at the beginning of the book, but I do want to thank in particular Mark Loeffler and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore for hosting this event, to Sarah Neuter for really making it happen and for comparing the event today. I want to thank Rosanna and Tim for agreeing to join the panel. I just want to say I'm very aware that it is a long book, and anybody who reads it to the end has my thanks and my sympathy. I'd also like to thank Jacqueline Norton and Oxford University Press for taking on such an enormously long book and for making it such a handsome object. I was very, very pleased with what came out at the final end of the process. So even if you don't have time to read it, and I don't think many people do have time to read it from cover to cover, you can at least page through and enjoy the rather lovely illustrations that OUP have included. Right, and thanks to all of you who have joined from around the globe. It's great to see many. I'm only seeing a small selection on my screen, but already many, many friends. So, and many strangers as well. So thanks to all of you. And yes, so back to you, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much. So my first question is really going to be one of these large intro questions. So of course, as we know, the title, I also have my, the title of the book is The Experience of Poetry, which anyone who reads a book will know is a completely apt title. And leads to, I think, like the opening questions that I'm going to read out in a moment. But the subtitle is also incredibly important for telling us just what kind of book this is. So the subtitle is From Homer's Listeners to Shakespeare's Readers. So I want to just read a few of the questions that Derek poses on the first page, and then sort of lead into my question. So this is Derek. What is a poem's mode of existence? Does the poem exist as the printed block of words on the page? Is it the vocal realization of those words, whether by human or machine? Does it enjoy some ideal existence that every visible or audible manifestation of these words alludes to? So as readers will know, what follows from this page in this opening is, as Erica said, a long and detailed book that falls into 4 sections. The first one really covers ancient Greece, the second, ancient Rome through the late antique period, the third, the medieval period, and the fourth, the Renaissance, mostly in England, but other parts of Europe too. So I guess my question is something, it's pretty open-ended, but your questions are so fundamental and even philosophical. And so I'm wondering how you got from the place where you were asking those questions to deciding that the way to answer them was to take your readers through this really incredibly well-researched and well-observed detailed study of history of experience. And if in a way, if you feel like that got you to an answer to the first very large questions that you asked.
Right, thanks. Yeah, just to give a bit of history, of my own history of writing this book, I originally conceived it as a history of performance, of poetic performance, partly because at the time, poetry in performance was becoming, and it obviously still is, a much more visible way of experiencing poetry around me. I was at Rutgers at the time. Exciting things were happening in New York, for instance. And poetry seemed to be becoming much less something to be encountered on the page, but something to be encountered in a live performance. And right to the end, I thought I was writing about performance, and indeed I was writing about performance in a kind of rather straightforward historical way. How was poetry performed throughout this period, and is there any continuity in the way it was performed throughout this period? And it was actually my readers, OUP sent it to 4 readers, taking care of the different periods in which it covers. And I realized in reading the readers' reports that the word experience came up again and again. And it was a word that I'd also quite separately been thinking about as a way of taking further and maybe enriching the notions that I worked with in the singularity of literature, the notion of the literary work as an event and the poem as a particular kind of event. I began to think more and more about the reader's side of that event, because it's not just an event happening in the vacuum, but it's an event happening as part of the reader's experience. So it dawned on me, reading these readers' reports, that all along I had been as interested in experience as in performance, and that actually experience was a rather more interesting, and as you say, philosophically interesting aspect of what I was studying. So it took a certain amount of rewriting, but actually not very much, to think through these periods, these practices from the reader's point of view, or the listener's point of view. The story does go from listeners to readers. Sorry, Sarah.
I was going to say it's a really inspirational story of peer review, actually. That it brought your book into this new place. And so then to return to your questions. What is a poem's mode of existence? Does it exist as a printed block of words? Is it a vocal realization? Does it enjoy an ideal existence? Is the answer like yes, yes, and yes? Would you say?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say it is all those things, but what it most essentially is an event in which a reader's experience plays a central part, that a poem comes into being every time it is read as a poem. And poems can be read in all sorts of ways, of course, and quite validly they can be read for historical information or psychological tracking of the author's own psyche or whatever. But to read a poem as a poem is to read it in a particular way, and the block of words on the page or the ideal in some world of Platonic forms becomes a poem, a real poem, only in that experience.
So that's interesting to me because of how much it privileges the role of the receiver of the poetry, right? The reader or the audience in many cases. And in a certain way, deprivileges the role of the author or the poet. And it leads to my second question, which is about the poet. So you also, another way you describe poetry that I think is really important in the book is as a cultural practice. Right, we can see poetry as a singular experience of one person, but what I think you're really showing is poetry as a through line from, as it were, culture to culture to culture. And so one of the interesting ways one could try to experience this book would be to, I think, like read chapter 1 on Homer and then skip forward and read chapter 12 on, Elizabethan poetry and see how different the world is, see how things like a text or an author or an authoritative text or a title are completely non-existent in chapter 1, but incredibly important in chapter 12. And yet what you're also doing, I think, is showing a lot of through lines between these worlds. And so I want to ask you specifically about, I think you call it I wrote it down, an irresolvable contradiction in the way poets are viewed. And especially, I'm thinking of your discussion on the Odyssey, where you talk about Demodocus, and you say that we see the beginning of a sort of conflicting view of the poet as someone who's receiving something externally from the gods and somebody who is crafting an object. And I think in a way you suggest that that's an ambiguity that continues on through different stages. Can you speak to that a little bit and explain it for people who haven't read that part?
Sure. Let me first of all just be a bit clearer about experience, because you suggested that I deprivilege the poet in the interest of the reader. And I realize that using a word like experience makes it sound as though I'm pushing some kind of highly subjective line, that poetry is only what a particular individual makes of it. So I want to just correct that quickly and say that experience, the kind of experience I'm talking about is a way of reading, a way of enjoying, a way of being affected by poetry that is a gift of the culture, that it is not some private way of being. It's in fact culturally instilled. It's different, of course, for every reader to some degree, but by and large, we absorb from the culture that we have lived in and lived through, the way we read poetry, the way that we make poems become poems. And part of the experience is very much, this is a kind of anti-new criticism line, although I was trained in new criticism, and I'm sure there are many signs of this in what I do. But I think a very important part of the experience is a sense of the poet, a sense of the maker, a sense of the making of this craft. So that's just to shift the emphasis a little away from the individual reader. The tension that you speak of, that I detected in several passages in the Odyssey, passages in which poetry seems to be at once a technical achievement learned through arduous training and a miraculous gift of the gods. I do think that runs throughout the history of poetry, at least until, I would say, till the present. But of course, I only trace it as far as the early 17th century in the book. But to the degree that both poets in talking about their own practice and readers in talking about this experience find it hard to capture in words what it is that, in the first place, brought these words into being, and in the second place, gave these words the power that they have. The difficulty we have in turning that into any kind of algorithm, the difficulty that we would have in programming any computer to deal with it, suggests on the one hand that it's, we wouldn't say miraculous anymore, but that it is certainly something that isn't in the realm of the calculable. But on the other hand, there's always, quite rightly, an emphasis on the skill needed to produce a poem. So I think that contradiction still exists, and it's a fruitful one.
That's great. Thank you. So I think I'm really going to ask one final question before I turn things over to my colleagues. I think one thing that anyone who's interested in this book should know is the fantastic attention it plays to the material, delivery, and reception of poetry. So there are just numerous questions that Derek covers here, but some of them are, was poetry in each period sung? And if it's sung, by the way, is it still poetry or is it song? Was it recited? Was it improvised, or was it recited from memory? Was it read from a book? If so, was it read aloud, or was it read silently? Was it read before people in a group, or was it read privately? In what ways did it foster kind of sociality or pageantry? So there are many wonderful questions like this that, as Derek gestured to in his opening words, make us or force us to think about poetry as a form of performance, which of course has been a huge topic, but also at the same time as a form of textuality. And it's really something to see these various features and kinds of ways of poetry just constantly revolving around you as you read. So my question comes though from one more aspect of the book that has been mentioned, but that I want to show, which is that it's actually beautifully illustrated. So I'm just going to share my screen for one sec. And just show you, almost without comment, a few images from the book. They're colored, they're lovely. If you're interested in poetry, writing, reading, and dissemination in any of these periods, this is a really fantastic resource. So here's one image from the archaic period. Here's one from the classical period in Greece. This is my own special focus, of course. And my question, the question that I will ask, comes to this passage. So this is from page 64 in Derek's text. And actually, I'll Derek, if you don't mind, I'll let you explain this. And if you don't mind, it'd be fantastic if you could tell us what we can learn from reading this passage.
Right. One thing I'd quite like to explain about my writing of this book was that for me, it was a tremendous learning experience. I'm not a classicist. I'm not a medievalist. I did write a PhD in the early modern period, but that was a very long time ago. So reading the material, the poems and poets themselves, reading what people have had to say about them was a great pleasure and an immense pleasure over the years. And so I learned things like the degree to which scriptio continua, the writing of texts without gaps between the words, was a norm for centuries, something I hadn't really taken on board. And I found this intriguing, and I thought there must be some way of understanding or showing that the reading aloud of poetry, of text for that matter, is inseparable from this way of writing. So I simply concocted a long sentence and set it out on the page as you see it, without gaps, as you might find an inscription in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and on into medieval manuscripts. If you read it, if you try and read it silently, as you would these days normally read a passage, it's quite a struggle. I mean, you can do it, but it takes a while. On the other hand, if you read it aloud and the shapes of the words, it's hard to explain, but the shapes of the words emerge much more clearly. You realize the difference between silent and vocal reading. So a set of sentences like this with no punctuation, or I've got my own face as well. No punctuation or word spacings is an approximation of what the ancient Greeks had to deal with reading it aloud. Reading it aloud seems to help comprehension. Your brain finds it easier to manage if you articulate as you read. You make surprisingly few mistakes doing it this way. I was reading it from the first version, not the second version, just to make that clear. So that was the little example that I gave, made up for the book, but it bears on this larger question of how readers of poetry throughout this period of many centuries would have engaged with poems on the page. Silent reading of poetry is something fairly recent.
Yes, this was such a wonderful way of being shown. I don't know if I think all readers should try reading it silently to themselves just to see how disabled you feel by that experience, and see how much we are really influenced by the materials around us and how we perceive the things we think of as most abstract. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn things over now to Tim.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Sarah for the invitation, to Derek for writing this fantastic book, and to all of you for being here. I want to say just quickly to begin that I think that this book, The Experience of Poetry, is just a masterpiece of literary scholarship that's so vast and sweeping in its vistas that it's amazing that someone managed to finish it in so relatively brief a span as 20 years. And what I want to do is just quickly kind of lay out my understanding of the text of the book in order to kind of set up my questions. So in its opening pages, this book presents a theory of poetry. A poem is, Attridge writes, a human event, repeatable, though never exactly the same in its repetitions, rather than a fixed material object or even an ideal one. Poetry differs from other kinds of discourses, we might say, insofar as it stresses the physical properties of language from which it is made, sounds, rhythms, silences, and so on. To experience a poem, then, is to undergo what Derek calls an event of and in language, with language understood as a material medium as well as a semantic resource. So this book seeks to convey the history of the experience of poetry as the experience of a real-time event that is necessarily shaped by the conditions in and through which a given poem is made manifest to those capable of experiencing it. So in moving from Homer to Shakespeare, we're taken on a journey of poetry from being a skilled oral public performance in the absence of a written text to a written text distributed through print to multiple readers in diverse locations who might have read it aloud or silently to themselves. And of course, what I've said is kind of a simplification of the main plot of this book. And what I so admire about this book, or one of the things I so admire about this book, is its like absolute resistance to simplification. There's a kind of like wonderful upswelling of complications as older modes of poetic performance are like continually refracted and echoed and repurposed in the historical periods through which we move. Now, this 2,400-year-old story is told by weaving together a number of disciplinary perspectives, right? So Derek uses the resources of literary history, drawing out the histories of genre, meter, rhyme, rhythm, line length, stanzaic form, and so on. But of course, as has already been intimated, he mobilizes book history and bibliography, tracing the different media and formats and scripts and types of material support that helped enable and therefore also, altered the manifestation of poetry. The histories of reading and literacy and education and politics also play a role. And throughout, Attridge unfolds what we might call, the sociology of poetic performance, describing and analyzing evidence pertaining to how people gathered in different forms of groups and spaces for various ends and in various relations in order to experience the real-time event of a poem's vocal or silent utterance. And he manages to do all of this massive, wide sweeping account, while also producing these really amazing and delicate readings of Homer and Telemachus and Claudian and Bede and Dante and Skelton, among many others. So as my perhaps too copious use of polysyndeton just now should convey, I think that Attridge's historical work is like really truly impressive. He's marshaled an incredible amount of learning lightly worn in order to make visible something almost impossibly ephemeral, the experience of poetry as it changed over historical time between ancient Greece and Renaissance England. So this summary leads to my first question. It's kind of a reframing or a reiteration of Sarah's initial question, and in part comes from the fact that this 2004 book, The Singularity of Literature, was, as I was telling Derek earlier, the first book I had to read in graduate school, and a book that I really admired. But I guess I'm interested in how all of the dense webs of historical evidence that you've compiled relate to the theory of poetry as experience that you lay out in the book's opening pages, right? Because all of the book's massive learning is in the service, right, of showing how poetry qua event altered across the very different historical and cultural circumstances that made such events possible in the first place. And so I was surprised just now, to learn that it was initially called the performance of poetry, and it was, so in fact the experience of poetry is almost like retroactively theorized, onto the history you've already written, which is wonderful. But I guess I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more then about like how you understand the relationship between the historical work that you've done and the theoretical impetus with which you begin, which is this understanding of poetry as a kind of experience, which is similar in some ways to The Singularity of Literature, which is, not a book with a really robust like historical through line. So I guess I'm just, again, kind of coming back to Sarah's first question to ask you to think through a little bit more, perhaps, the relationship between theory and history in this book. I hope I haven't gone on too long with my intro.
No, that's great. Thanks, Tim. Thank you for summarizing what is probably an unsummarizable book. I should say, you praise it for the detail that each section, each historical period calls forth. I had assumed when I started this project, being as ignorant as I was, that I would simply be summarizing the findings of scholars in each of these periods, that it wouldn't take me 20 years to write, would be much, certainly 5, because I would find out what classicists thought about performance, and I would find out what medievalists thought, and so on. And of course, everywhere I looked, there was dissension and debate and argument. So I then had to go back to primary materials in many cases and make up my own mind about who was right or who was wrong. And you'll have noticed, I'm sure, that the book is studded with perhapses and maybes, and it's possible that, because it seems to me that one of the I don't know, besetting sins maybe is too strong a word, but one of the dangers that are not always avoided in writing about these periods is that the evidence is so exiguous, so scanty, that it's probably in many cases not possible to make the kind of outright assertions that scholars like to make. So I ended up being quite cautious. But in every period that I was looking at, I suppose the point is, even when I was thinking in terms of experience, there was no getting inside people's heads, and the amount of reportage about people's experiences of poetry is very, very limited. People down the centuries didn't think it mattered very much to talk about how they experienced, how they enjoyed poetry. So it really remained a material, very much a material history, a history of what poetry looked like, what it sounded like, or might have sounded like, who spoke it or read it from a text or memorized it, and so on. The Singularity of Literature was a book that I wrote when I took time off this project. I think I'd written the chapters on ancient Greece when I just got more and more interested in the theoretical aspect of what I was doing, and felt it wouldn't be in place to have, 3 large chapters on the theory of poetry in this book. So I set it aside and wrote The Singularity of Literature. But certainly the 2 books I see as continuous, and continuous with other work. For instance, my writing of a book on the fiction of J.M. Coetzee, which actually was in parallel with writing The Singularity of Literature. I do feel that I've shown in this book that poetry was part of individual and social life, something that we now call poetry, may have been called other things down the centuries, but that the experiencing of language in a particular way, as you summarized very, very handily, the experiencing of an art form in which language is a material presence, or a material actor. The sounds, the rhythms, the meanings, but meanings not as something you penetrate the word through, but through something you penetrate through the word to reach, but rather something which is always in play. That seems to have been, I mean, I didn't know that this would be the case when I started the book, but it does seem to have been something we can identify in every Western culture, from at least from Homeric Greece, probably from before, that we don't have the evidence until, I would say, the present. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a really quick follow-up, if I might, and one of the things that I love so much about this book is just like how deeply historical it is. And it's the case that like almost everything, with very few exceptions about poetry, like changes, right? Over the course of the book, right? Its cultural status, how it's presented, even its very mode of existence has changed pretty fundamentally by the end. But the experience of poetry, right, remains a kind of constant, like throughout the book, as an experience as a term, right? And so I guess, like, and this is a selfish question insofar as I write about a poetry in relation to the history of experience, and understood, as a set of concepts and ways of thinking by which people, understand themselves and represent themselves. But I'm curious, I guess about the degree to which experience in this book is also a historical term, in the way in which poetry is, like, or is experience something that is historicized or should be historicized, or is it, something more constant, across the period that you study? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because as I was saying, we don't have access to experience as such. I think I would say it's both. I think the evidence of the pleasure taken in this crafting of language suggests there is something that remains constant. But of course, experience is bound to be a cultural and a historical phenomenon. So we can talk about the way poetry might be experienced in a culture in which its prime function is to impart knowledge, as opposed to a culture in which its prime function is to produce a peculiar kind of pleasure, which nothing else quite produces. And at the end of the day, there's no evidence we can call on to distinguish the degrees of one or other. I suppose one of the ways in which I was trying to counter a particular understanding of Homeric verse, for instance, was to show, I hope, that its emotional power was a crucial feature, because so much has been made of Homeric epic as a conveyor of historical information, which it certainly was, but there's so much evidence within the texts themselves that another function was to create emotional responses in readers, emotional responses which are not that different from emotional responses we might feel now. So yes, so I think the answer is both. It's a historical experience, is a historical phenomenon, but in the case of poetry, there seems to be something at the heart of it which remains constant.
Okay, thank you. Do I have time for one question, or am I out of time at this point?
A little one.
Okay, a really short one. Okay, so this book is full of like really amazing moments. One of my favorites was your reading of Callimachus in the chapter on Alexandria. I thought that was beautiful and wonderful, and it really made me want to read Callimachus. And then you have a little note where you like kind of mention, you know, John Donne, I don't know, in kind of conjunction with Callimachus. And I know you wrote a dissertation on like Elizabethan meter, and, you know, so I'm an early modernist, and often, you know, we're kind of looking back at the classical past insofar as it's mediated by, you know, Renaissance humanism and what kinds of editions were available and what kinds of books they had to read and so on. But you had you're kind of like looking at it, you know, in its own right, you know, kind of progressively, as opposed to, you know, as it would have been understood and refracted, et cetera, in the Renaissance, which is how I would look at it. So I guess, and perhaps how you were trained to look at it as a scholar of Renaissance literature doing your PhD. So my question is, does that change anything, you know, about how you understood Renaissance poetry? That is, you know, focusing on Callimachus qua Callimachus, you know, or Homer qua Homer, as opposed to, you know, the poets as like a kind of humanist figure. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. And since we don't have much time, I'll just say, yes, certainly. Discovering Callimachus was one of the great delights of working on that part of the book. And Callimachus had been a name, as you say, someone you're aware of being important for later periods, but to take his work on its own terms was just immensely exciting, and helped one understand the later attraction of, you know, all the way up to Ezra Pound. But yes, so the answer is a definite yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And Rosanna.
Thank you. Many of my questions, in a sense, have already been asked by both Sarah and Tim, but I will look at my notes and see what I come up with. And again, like the rest of you, I want to thank Derek for this remarkable book. Thank Sarah for bringing us together. Thank Starsha for helping it happen. Thank Tim. I read well-weighed syllables pretty much when it came out in 1974, not assigned in a course, but because I was passionate about how to make poems. And that is a marvelous book for those of you who haven't read it, about, well, the subtitle is Elizabethan Verse in Classical Meters. And forever since, I have been more than interested. I'm passionate about the experiments in quantitative meter in the 16th century in England. And your book, Well-Weighed Syllables, to me was a kind of Bible, has been for many, many years. And I recommend it to young poets in English. They think I'm crazy, but I say, I don't think you can write good poetry in English now unless you have your ear open to what Campion was trying to do, and his argument with Samuel Daniel about whether it's possible to hear quantity in English, even if it's not systematic, and Daniel's robust refusal of that position, and this kind of argument that was going on with Spencer and Harvey and Sidney and that whole world, like the Sidney Psalms, which have some beautiful alcaics in them, etc. So I wonder if you could, and I realize that in terms of this magnificent historical sweep of poetry as both a continuous practice and very specific to different languages and cultural periods. In a way, I read the experience of poetry as leading back up to well-weighed syllables. How do we get to Campion? How do we get to Sidney? So I wonder if you could say more about quantitative meters, both in their own functions in Greek and Latin, and in their adaptations in Renaissance humanism, and in the sort of failure but weird possible success in English.
Great, thanks. Well, one of the things that I learned in writing this book was that when I, as a PhD student, found myself trying to understand the quantitative experiments in the 16th century, was that the issue that I was dealing with had been around in Europe for centuries. I took it to be a peculiar thing that happened when Renaissance humanists, because of the prestige of Latin and Greek verse, tried to make English conform to similar rules. I thought this, was the result only of a peculiar situation in the 16th and early 17th century when Latin was pronounced pretty much along the same lines as the native language in whatever country you happen to live. But I discovered in writing this book that the disappearance of quantity from spoken Latin and Greek in the early post-classical period meant that this issue of quantities in those languages not being audible, but rather being intellectual, came about and was sustained for many centuries. So quantity, which is still something of a mystery in classical verse, but it was clearly something that was heard or sensed by listeners and readers, disappeared when accentual ways of pronouncing those languages, in line with the new languages coming from the north and the great migrations. So the result was that the continuously treasured works of Latin and Greek poets became less a matter of how it sounded and more a matter of knowing through learning, through following the rules of prosody, knowing how to scan a line. So this verse seemed to have a remarkable sophistication that native verse, indigenous verse lacked. And you see this again and again, complaints about the crudeness of verse in the vernacular languages, whether it be English or German or French, compared to the sophistication of this verse inherited from Greece and Rome. But the attempts certainly gathered pace in the 16th century. Humanism did have that effect of getting poets to think, well, our own language, the poetry in our own language is crude and debased and relies purely on the ear. Let's see if we can instill something more sophisticated into our language. And as you were suggesting, it really was in English, it played itself out in the contest between Campion and Daniel. Campion was highly successful in his compromise. He managed to write poems which both followed quantitative rules, but also scanned accentually. But Daniel really pulled the rug out from under his feet, pointing out that you didn't need the quantities. English verse could be pretty sophisticated, and by the early 17th century had become pretty sophisticated, as subtle, as complex as anything emanating from Greece and Rome.
Thank you. Yes, and maybe that leads to my second question, which is also Renaissance. It's a Shakespeare question. I found utterly fascinating around certain figures we think we know, like Wyatt at the beginning of the 16th century Shakespeare, toward the end, Johnson. You sort of end with Johnson, 1616, the works. Introducing Shakespeare into this plot is not about the plays. It's a story partly about printing, as you tell it. You give us the tale of the printing of Venus and Adonis in 1593, the printing of Lucrece in 1594, and then the other story about the sonnets. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that, about the almost oblique role that Shakespeare acts in your story.
Right. Well, you'll have seen the subtitle has Shakespeare's readers rather than Shakespeare's audience, and I suppose I was on more familiar territory when I reached the late 16th century. But even then, I found that I hadn't quite ever taken on board the degree to which Shakespeare's ambitions as a prestigious writer, depended on his poetry, on Venus and Adonis and Lucrece. Not so much on the sonnets, which are a different story, but it was fascinating to trace some of the more recent work done on just publication figures, both of poetry in general, which clearly came out in large quantities in the 1590s and into the early 17th century. But in particular, the huge success of the two long narrative poems by Shakespeare, not just in figures of publication and print, but in the number of quotations that occur in drama at the time. So that Venus and Adonis becomes a source for seduction techniques, usually very unsuccessful on stage. But it did for me cast Shakespeare in a different light. Shakespeare the poet, Shakespeare who wanted to be read, Shakespeare who went to the best printer he could find in London in order to have a really good-looking book for people to read. All of that cast a different light on Shakespeare. I have to say, at the same time, an argument that I rather tentatively advance is that the plays, Shakespeare's, but also many others, were giving people the chance to hear magnificent English poetry. And when I searched for evidence of public performance of poetry in other circumstances, not as parts of drama, I found very, very little, although it was something of a commonplace that, oh yes, the Elizabethan period, there were poets holding forth in taverns and halls and all over the place. You could hear public performances of poetry. In fact, there's very, very little evidence, and it may be because of the success of the theatre that public performance of poetry, which had been clearly an important part of medieval culture in a household, for instance, in large households, seems to have disappeared and been replaced perhaps by the pleasures of the theatre.
I found that very interesting and surprising, because I had thought that still in the Renaissance, the reading aloud, the performing of poetry within a large household was a custom, and you certainly opened my eyes about that. I'm going to stop my questions now so that we have room for our audience to ask questions. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rosanna. And Tim, that last bit you talked about, that crux of perhaps drama stepping in and kind of taking over the role of poetry, is so fascinating to me. I hope you'll write that book too, while you're writing the three other books you seem to write at once. So we do have a great question in the chat, which I'll ask. Let me just say, I also see we have all these amazing thinkers and writers about poetry with us today. So please feel free to speak up. You can just say, you want to ask a question, you could ask your own question if you like. So the question we have in the chat is, what can we learn from the experience of poetry by deaf people toward an understanding of a fundamental nature of poetry, if there is one? That was a really interesting question.
Yes, it's not one I've thought of. Yeah. I would have to say that I know nothing about the inner world of a deaf person's engagement with the external world. I'm just trying to think through a poem, whether it's possible to have a conception of sound, or whether that is impossible, and maybe this differs from case to case. But I do feel that the articulation of the sound of words is so central to poetry that it would be very difficult to imagine a full appreciation of a poet's work without some idea, at least, of that. What remains, of course, even without the sound, is the temporality, is the movement of language through time, the control of meaning, the building up of tension and relaxation and climax and so on. So all of that is still there. But of course, poets do put an immense amount of effort into, most poets, into the sound of the words that they choose to write. So it's a question I'll have to keep thinking about. Thank you.
It'd be great to have an account from people who are deaf about what that experience is like.
Yes, yes.
So I'll read out a question, and then we have one other from Reginald Gibbons. Although you also could say your question if you prefer. Do you put ceremonial purposes and substance into the category of poetry as pleasure? So this includes funerals, coronations, and so on in ancient and later pre-industrial culture. So, so again, Reggie, you can ask your own question, but my understanding of this is, are these ceremonial experiences should we think of them as pleasurable as well?
Yeah, right. Well, I particularly in talking about the 16th century, where there is a lot of evidence of progresses and pageants and Lord Mayor's, the annual Lord Mayor's Day tilts. All of these involved poetry, often not very good poetry. And clearly the primary function of the verse being uttered was, as you say, ceremonial expressions of fealty to the Queen and so on. I suspect that only in some cases was there what I think of as the pleasure of poetry. Verse, of course, can be used for all sorts of purposes and has been used for all sorts of purposes. And these ceremonial events would be one of them. But who knows, every now and then something might have got through the ritual and become a real poem. Certainly the Lord Mayor's events later in the century, in the early 17th century, often involved work by very, very well-known poets, not so much in the earlier period. So my answer, I suppose, is maybe sometimes, not always.
We have a question from Jonathan Collar. Do you have any plan to carry the history past the Renaissance? What about the experience of poetry in the Romantic period? And I'd like to have you write a chapter on this moment right now, personally. So that last part was me, with Sarah.
Yeah, well, as I found, and as I said, I couldn't simply summarize the findings of any period in terms of its experience of poetry, and I suspect the same would be true of every period since the early 17th century. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not going to produce a little theory of romantic poetry here and now. I'm sure there are many conflicting views by scholars on the nature of poetry. I've written on Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads, which I think is an important document about the experience of poetry at the end of the 18th century. But no, I'm not going to be tempted, Jonathan, into saying anything rash at this point. But yeah, maybe I'll write that book one day.
Would have been great, yes.
And we have a question from Andy Parker, who asks if he is wrong to trace some of your interests in experience to post-war French thought.
Well, of course, Andy, you know very well it is. Yes, my long association with and interest in the work of Derrida lies behind my thinking about the singularity of literature, about the idea of the event. But I would like to think I've taken it in directions that Derrida didn't and might not have approved of. The experience of poetry, not something he ever addressed. But yeah, even though this is a very historical work, I can't avoid having some Derridean influence in the back of my mind as I engage with, certainly as I engage with particular poems and the way they have been read. Yeah, that'll do.
Richard Stryer asks, the poetry that was widespread in the Elizabethan period was through song, ballads, settings of lyrics, and so forth. Much ancient and medieval poetry was sung. What difference does poetry being or not being sung mean or make? It's a big question.
Obviously it makes a difference. And I do try to distinguish between song, in which the tonal system and metrical system of the language is, as it were, handed over to an external, to a separate set of principles, and heightened speech, where the tones and rhythms of the language themselves become the dominant force in the work. It seems likely that this all begins with a kind of recitation in the Homeric epic, where the natural sounds and tonal shifts of the language are heightened, rather than having some melody imposed on them. But soon the two forms do go in separate ways. So that's one answer to the question. There is a distinction. It's not always very clear. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether we are dealing with song or with poetry. The other aspect of the question, I think, is that I forget what I was going to say now. There is another aspect to this question, but maybe there's no time to answer it. Let me just think for a moment. No, it's gone. I will.
Throw you one final question to close us out today, and if you want to circle back
Yeah.
to the very large question of song, then so this question is from Don Harmon, and this, I think we will end here. He notes that this book covers many years from Homer to Shakespeare, so that's 2,450 years. Many more years, he says, than it does miles. Classics in the Western tradition are tailored for this kind of diachronic study, but how does this high level of geographic specificity affect your claims about what the experience of poetry is, or form in such a general sense? So this is about the geographical specificity of the book.
Yeah, good. I remembered what I was going to say to Richard. Just that thinking of poetry and song, of course, many of what originated as songs became poems for later periods. So that the Alexandrians, for instance, the Hellenistic poets, were dealing with poems written down on papyrus rolls, which had lost their music, so they became poems, and many of those songs are still poems for us. Yes, the geographical question, I mean, it's a slightly odd book in the sense that it starts in Greece, it goes to Rome, it then spreads around the continent of Europe, but it ends very firmly in Britain and largely in England. And the excuse for that is that I couldn't have kept it down to 250,000 words without, if I had tried to do justice to all the other European countries, let alone thinking about poetic traditions in other cultures and other languages. So I would love to learn about Arabic, Chinese, South American traditions, but there simply wouldn't mean space. And I don't know the answer to the question, if that is the question. Is there something in other cultures that would be analogous to the things that I've traced in Western Europe? I don't know, but it's a good question. Perhaps there's somebody out there who will pick it up and run with it.
Well, and that open invitation. I want to thank everybody. This was such a wonderful conversation. I mean, I want to thank everyone who came, especially Rosanna and Tim for your really wonderful questions, and especially Professor Attridge for this amazing book, and just the experience of engaging with it and with you Thanks to the Seminary Co-op and thanks to Starsha and Poetry and Poetics. I hope to see you all again in some fashion, even in person someday. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.